Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We had trouble with this stream. We're very sorry about that, but we'll go ahead now. Um, Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 65 of hosting esteemed guests for the series, which will continue till August 17th. Today, we'll be speaking to Ms. Anam Zakaria. She is the author of 1971, The People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Be- Between the Great Divide, a journey into Pakistan-administered Kashmir, and the Footprints of Partition, narratives of four generations of Pakistanis and Indians, which was the first book written in 2015 and won her the 2017 KLF-German Peace Prize. Welcome to the show, Anam, and thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure being in conversation with the 1947 Partition Archive team. So delighted to be here.
Well, we'll go straight ahead into the questions since we're late already. How did your interest in partition start?
I grew up in Punjab. I grew up in Lahore, and I heard a lot about partition from my maternal grandmother. She was based in Lahore at the time of partition. She was in her early 20s, and she was volunteering alongside her siblings at one of the largest refugee camps at Walton, Lahore. So I heard a lot about the violence, the bloodshed, the blood-strewn trains from her, both in terms of what she had witnessed, but also what she had heard from that period. But my actual research and curiosity in partition began with my first job. I think I was very fortunate that my first job was with the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, and I was put in charge of the oral history program in Lahore. So my job, my daily bread and butter was essentially going to people's homes, first and second generation Pakistanis, and hearing about their life stories. And a huge part of that, of course, was partition, where they were in 1947, before 1947, what their migration journeys were like. And I think it was sitting through those interviews that I started to realize how little I knew about partition. Of course, I had come across the status narratives, information in my textbooks and in mainstream discourse, but the nuances I began to hear in these stories, the diversity I began to pick up, and just kind of realizing that these experiences existed on a spectrum, and they couldn't be neatly packaged the way they are in our conventional sources of history. So that's what got me curious, and I wanted to know more. And then I wanted to know more about my own family. And at some point, I also started to realize that my paternal side of my family had a partition story that I had not grown up very acquainted with, because my paternal grandparents passed away before I was born, but they had migrated from Batala. And so there was a migration story there. And there's so much I still don't know. I think there's so much to still unearth, but that's kind of how the journey began for me.
Well, you've conducted many oral narratives in both India and Pakistan. Would you please talk about some of the interviews which left a deep impression on you and about your journey in general as well, please?
Yeah, there's so many that it's really hard to pick a few, but I think there's some themes that emerged that really shifted something in me. And the first one were actually stories of longing and of nostalgia. And I think when I say that, it's really important to contextualize in terms of where I was coming from. I'm very curious about both personal histories and oral histories, but also state histories and state narratives. And I think in my research, at least, what I've noticed is that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, of course, as well, they all have a very different macro narrative of partition. And in Pakistan, the memory of partition is also very much enmeshed with the memory of independence and nation making. And so there's this sentiment of triumph. And the violence is then couched as sacrifice or martyrdom. So as a third generation Pakistani, I didn't really have access to a lot of that nostalgia or longing. And I grew up kind of amidst that hostility, with the sense of, why would you ever want to look back? But here I was sitting with partition survivors, and so many of them, countless of them, were saying, our dying wish is to be able to go back once, to be able to go to our homes, to our neighborhood, to meet our friends, to meet our neighbors and relatives that they had left behind. So I think there was definitely that theme of longing and nostalgia that made me realize that there was something more here. I think apart from that, there were stories of rescue, again, stories that I had been until then unfamiliar with. communities risking everything, their own lives, to save, quote unquote, the other, right? Whoever that was, depending on where you were in that moment. I think that really stayed with me. Stories of divided families, an Indian sister and a Pakistani sister, and I think that was really important because we talk about visa hostilities and we talk about bureaucracy and we read about these things, in newspapers, and we hear about the dry statistics. But what does it actually mean, right? What does it mean for people in their everyday lives when one of you is Indian, one of you is Pakistani, and you can't meet, right? How does that completely shape your family's legacy? And what are the impacts that it has on your children and grandchildren? So I think there were so many stories like that. But after I did my first book, after I had published The Footprints of Partition, I began to also really come to the realization that I had to look beyond Punjab, right? I think a lot of focus of partition literature has been Punjab because of the sheer degree of violence that Punjab witnessed. But I think it's very important also that other geographies had very different manifestations. So when I went to Bangladesh, I started to document stories of the partition of Bengal. When I went to Kashmir, right, and there's so many regions I haven't personally done work, but now there's more literature, more work, more archival work coming up from Sindh and other regions. You began to realize the nuanced manifestations and the variations of partition, and I think those stories are really, really important to capture, and they kind of unearth a whole new reality. And then within these regions, of course, when you look across caste, you look across class, you look across gender, you just uncover new dimensions of partition.
So, Anam, recently we had an academic from Bengal, and she worked a lot on the Bengali partition. So, what is your personal experience of interviewing these people? And as you mentioned, the different nuances between, for example, Bengal, Kashmir, and Punjab, and their different partitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that requires its own focus. My focus when I went to Bangladesh was 1971, but of course I wanted to look at the relationship between 1971 and 1947. And one of the things that really emerged was how protracted the migration was. So Punjab kind of saw this exodus, right? A lot of people that I interviewed personally talked about leaving their homes overnight and locked and just kind of fleeing. Bengal, as I understand, had a very different experience of that, where that migration was violent in other ways and fractured in other ways and protracted and continued, sometimes even for decades for certain families. So I think that was definitely one of the primary differences that I picked up. In Kashmir, of course, the ongoing legacy of partition and the ongoing hostility between India and Pakistan is most gravely felt over there, in this region that is sandwiched in between these two hegemonic nuclear powers. So when I was doing interviews with women and children on the line of control in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, or when I was visiting refugee camps where those who have had to flee the crackdown by the Indian army, though those stories and those stories of division, those stories of violence, right, that is so pervasive, and that continues to leave everyday imprints and that continues to unfold, is an entirely different reality and experience.
And you were also part of a cultural exchange program. Would you please talk about the effects on younger children? How do we converse with the younger generation about partition? How does it impact them? And what idea do children have of people across the border?
Yeah, so my research at least shows that there are intergenerational shifts that are taking place. And while I was running this oral history program for the Citizens Archive, I was also running the Exchange for Change program, which connected school children in India or Pakistan. And that's really where I saw that kind of gap, that increasing mistrust between the generations. So here you had, grandparents saying, "My dying wish is to be able to go across," and you had children saying, "We don't even want to talk to each other," right? And I've continued some of that work in a very small capacity after my tenure with CAP ended as well. And I think that because of the way in which that violence is packaged and the way in which it's told in one-sided ways, depending on what side of the border you're at, you might come across very different history. That has a grave impact. And then you add jingoistic kind of media discourse to that, and the fact that most Indians and Pakistanis never really get to meet each other. Gallup Pakistan did a survey back in 2016 that I've quoted a lot, which showed that over 70% of Pakistanis have never met an Indian, and I assume that the number would be significantly high on the other side as well. So I think in this context, what you read, what you hear can become sometimes the only truth, quote unquote, that you know and that you hang on to. And I think there's such efforts to otherize, there's such conscious efforts to demonize communities and those who live across the border, that young children often do have very hardline perceptions. And they also have a much more packaged understanding of the past, right? So whereas I don't want to romanticize, because there were absolutely fault lines, but whereas their grandparents would also talk about a time in which they lived amidst each other alongside those fault lines, right? Often children can't even imagine that. So that is the reality. But having said that, I don't think that any of this can be reductionist. So I don't think that textbooks can entirely shape you. I have seen classrooms where teachers will use that same content in very innovative ways to push children to think critically, where they'll bring in other material, where children will have access to other kinds of exposure through their families or otherwise, where other critical conversations are taking place. I think social media, these kind of platforms that we're on right now, the archival work that is happening has so much power. I think I'm also really heartened by how many young people are writing books, are curious. I mean, even at the 1947 archive, the number of interns and young scholars. So that's really where my hope is. And I think when we talk about how do we teach children about partition, of course, it has to be in an age-appropriate way. But I think the focus needs to be not on dry statistics so much, but on the human impact and on humanizing each other. How do we bring in oral histories? How do we bring in these nuances that get filtered out of state histories, of conventional histories? How do we bring in more of a holistic approach, right, where we're not teaching partitioned and butchered content, which is essentially agenda driven to promote hatred, right? But how do we bring the reality of the violence that partition unleashed on people, alongside these other facets, right, which depict those very humane, very real, very raw emotions. I think we need to get more comfortable with our uncomfortable past and be able to address that more wholly. And I think children have great capacity to empathize and to learn and to love. So I think our approach needs to kind of be premised on those elements.
I think it's very interesting you mentioned social media and its capacity for transforming the current relationship that this generation has. We interviewed a person from Lahore, and he had a fascinating story. He'd lived in India for 6 years before coming to Pakistan. He had a Sikh name. He was living with Sikhs, and his story. He met his mother after 40 years. He was living in Lahore, but only got to meet her after like a span of 40 years. And so his interview, someone interviewed him, put it on YouTube, and that video had 2 million plus views. And even during the interview, he was so happy. He was like, everyone knows my story now. People from all over the world, Indians, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, they all connect with me on Facebook. And he showed me the message exchange he had with the house he lived at. In the people who were giving him refuge, one of his friends from that area contacted him beneath one of his videos. With social media, he was just all encompassed with social media and just talking to dozens of people every day from all over the divide.
Yeah, and that's the power of new technology. I use it a lot. I use Skype exchanges between Indian and Pakistani students, just as a fostering dialogue. There's so many stories that we're coming across now of this connection that families and people are able to make generations later. There's so much power. At the same time, I'm very aware that it's a tool and you can use it anyway, and it's used to promote hatred as well. So I think we have to be very conscious of how we leverage the resources that we have, and what we do with them. Yeah.
So you've published 3 books already, and all of those 3 talk about the divide between the 3 countries. Would you please shed light on your book for the audience and tell us what's coming next?
Sure. So the work started off with this curiosity I had about this intergenerational divide that I was witnessing in my day job at the Citizens Archive between the younger generations and the older generations. So that first book looks at the intergenerational memory of partition and how it's evolving, and how post-partition events have left imprints on that memory of partition. Because for me, partition is not a static event. It's not something we can just leave behind that is insulated from everything that's happened after. I think post-partition events have had huge impact on the memory and understanding of partition itself. But as I said, once I'd completed that work, I realized myself that I needed to look beyond Punjab to really understand the implications of partition. And that's the work that took me to Kashmir, where I, through oral histories, wanted to peel through and unlearn the status narratives, the hegemonic narratives that I had grown up with as a Pakistani about Kashmir, and really listen to people and to their experiences. It's very much an unlearning journey for me. But as I was doing that work, I realized that I can't truly understand India and Pakistan's existing policies in Kashmir until I understand 1971, because I do think it's one of the most defining years. We don't talk about it enough, I feel, but it is absolutely defining in terms of people's lives and what it did, and in terms of regional politics and regional relationships today, and policies, which are most gravely felt, of course, again in Kashmir. So the journey has been quite organic in that sense. I didn't really know what was coming next until I was in it, and then I was curious, and it's all been learning and unlearning for me. What I'm working on now is a project on post-partition violence. I'm looking at mob violence, and I'm looking at how different societies have these arbitrary lines that you're not supposed to trespass. And I'm very curious about what happens when there is a supposed and apparent trespass off those arbitrary lines. How does society become complicit in legitimizing that violence that we are seeing across South Asia, but we also see it in other parts of the world? So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at that creation of mob violence, and the way in which communities become complicit in legitimating it.
And would you please shed light on the importance of oral history, especially within the context of partition and the experiences that people have gone through in partition?
I mean, for me, it's been instrumental. It has honestly changed. I mean, I don't think it would be an overstatement to say it's kind of changed my life and my perspective. It's given me a new lens into my own past, my own heritage, and it's not all rosy. There are uncomfortable things there, but I think it's so important to be able to have that deeper, more nuanced understanding. I think oral histories allow us to move beyond national projects and jingoism and statist histories, packaged histories that otherize and demonize. I think oral histories also really have the power to bring forth the nuances I was mentioning, and the diversity of experience that we often don't see and don't hear about. Because one thing that states are quite good at are homogenizing experiences, and we need to move beyond that. We need to understand that not everybody experienced partition the same way. A lot of it depended on where you were, what was your social class, what was your caste, and so much more. And I still don't think there's enough material out there on that. So I think oral histories can really offer you that. And personally, one of the things that I'm really curious about is, I think it tells you so much about the quote unquote the event, whatever it might be that you're discussing. But I think it also tells you about, what are the memories that people have chosen to hang on to. What do they want to remember 50, 70, 75 years later? And what does it mean to share those memories, right, with particular people? And what does it mean when you consciously or unconsciously start to silence other memories, right? When you choose to forget, because these are choices people make consciously or unconsciously all the time. So I'm very curious also about the process of oral history and what it offers, the method of it. What does it mean to share these stories with me, a Pakistani? What does it mean when I'm sitting in Punjab doing these interviews? I come from Punjab. My family has a partition story, but when I went to Kashmir, when I went to Bangladesh, it was a very different experience for me, and very different ethical considerations for me as well. What does it mean to sit down with a Pakistani and share or not share? What are the things that will not come forth? So I think these are all very, very interesting points of query, and they reveal a lot about people and about places. So I think oral history has tremendous power. I think that the last thing I'll also say is that often we look at state histories and oral histories as completely different. In my research, at least, I've been curious about the ways in which they shape each other as well. So you can also notice that sometimes oral histories will shift because they're not completely insulated from what's happening in and around them. And I think that itself is something that's very interesting. What does it mean to interview somebody, about partition in the 1960s versus today, with everything that's happened and how divisive these borders are? And at the same time, what is the potential of oral history and the capacity of oral history to resist statist narratives? So by remembering certain things that the state is so bent upon forgetting, how do you resist and puncture through those state silences? So I think that relationship between state history and oral history can tell us a lot as well.
You mentioned the nuances there, and in some of my experiences when I've interviewed villagers, people who used to live in the village while partition went on. For us, living in the cities and having taken in all that state narrative, partition seems all-encompassing. We're fully engrossed in it. It is the raison d'etre of the whole country, right? It's the reason Pakistan exists. When you go to the village, people didn't even know what 14th August 1947 was like. It was just another day to them. So, like you said, for me, that was a different experience, and showed the power of oral history and how it can show you the nuances and the differences in perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anam. That was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for um, this, I would call it an oral history masterclass that you just provided us. Thank you for that pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me again. And yeah, apologies about the tech glitches on my end at the beginning. I'm really glad we had this conversation, and all the very best.
Thank you. And for those who are joining us, please tune in next week for another amazing conversation with Dr. Ankur Datta. The 1947 Partition Archive is hosting this series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd and August 17th to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan, 75 days after the Partition Plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you very much again, and please show us your love and support by sending the hearts and like emojis under the video. For any query, DM us on social media or connect with any of our team members.